Nation's still figuring out just exactly how to think about the events yesterday down in the Capitol, but certainly the role that social media plays in fomenting that kind of outrage and also plays in our elections and how people understand reality these days is something that is going to be explored more in depth. And for more on this, we bring in Nina Jankowicz. She's a senior fellow at the Wilson Center and author of the book, How to Lose the Information War. So, Nina, I guess as you think about the current state of misinformation and disinformation, are you just not surprised by sort of what we saw fomented and then eventually executed yesterday?
Yeah, I think the feeling this morning among disinformation researchers is kind of a feeling of, we're upset that no one listened, frankly. I have been telling the story about how I was testifying in front of the House Intel Committee in October, and I said disinformation is dismantling democracy, and I was challenged about that assertion. I was asked to give examples, and I think yesterday is a very clear example. This vigilante mob interrupting the very goings on of democracy with the intent of committing violence. I mean, the things that we were seeing and hearing yesterday came straight from QAnon, came straight from many of the violent extremist movements that we've seen flourish on social media over the past couple of years, and certainly that we've heard in the president's online rhetoric. And so I think you can draw a straight line from dis and misinformation that has really flourished and been engendered by the Trump administration to the events that we saw yesterday.
So then, Nina, it's Julie here. It's good to see you. So then it comes back to what to do about it, right? Because you have a couple of separate issues, right? You have on the one hand the disinformation campaigns coming out, whether it be from foreign actors or from domestic ones. And then you also have the sort of use of the social media platforms to organize. Yesterday, for example, there was reporting that on social media networks, there were directions, to take certain streets to avoid authorities to get to the Capitol building. So let's take the first part first. What do you do about this disinformation that's out there?
Well, the first thing I think is that we need equal enforcement of the terms of service that the platforms are governed by. We like to think of the internet as a free speech zone, but these are private enterprises that have rules, right? That we've signed up to and we're meant to adhere to when we're on these platforms. And until yesterday, the platforms chose not to enforce those rules on one of the most important users of those platforms, President Trump. And now that they've finally decided to do that, it might be too little too late, right? We've seen the example of what happens when this sort of rhetoric is allowed to flourish. And they're finally taking action, not, I think, kind of curiously, on the day that we found out the Democrats would have control of both chambers of Congress after 4 years of inaction. So that's number one. We also need more transparency and oversight about the content moderation decisions that the platforms are making. Right now, we need to take their word for it. I would like some sort of higher body to understand how our speech is being moderated.
Nina, if President Trump does get banned from Twitter, what type of effect do you think that has on his supporters and others who are on the platform?
Well, I think it's going to have some, unintended effects. There's already this idea, this allegation that there is anti-conservative bias on the platforms, even though there has been study after study proving, in fact, that often it's liberal voices that are being silenced, particularly minority voices on social media. So I think we're going to see more allegations of that. But we've also seen this mass migration, this sort of self-imposed deplatforming of conservatives to alternative platforms like Parler and Gab. The infrastructure on those platforms isn't so great. So they've been struggling under the weight of this kind of mass migration. But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw President Trump, after he is out of office, try to migrate to one of those platforms and bring a lot of his followers with him, which we've seen, working out in some ways, not only to social media, but to networks like OAN and to Newsmax in recent days, as the president has said, Fox News or certain platforms aren't worth hanging out on anymore.
I was going to ask you about Parler. I mean, what's the danger of that migration that you're talking about, where people are sort of more siloed than ever, not just with their news sources, but with their social media networks?
Well, I think one of the big dangers is exactly what you just pointed out, Julie, confirmation bias, right? They're not going to be exposed to any other sources, although they're very little exposed to them right now on social media as it stands. The other thing is that, there's a lot less oversight over these alternative platforms. They don't have the infrastructure of content moderators or policy staff that are working to ensure there aren't unintended consequences of what's going on the platforms and the products that they're putting out there. And they've been, by disinformation researchers, of course, we're looking at those platforms, but the rest of the world really isn't focusing on them. And that's a problem because we're not necessarily aware of the sorts of narratives that are coming up through those platforms. And again, there have been a lot of Cassandras in the counter disinformation community over the past 4 years that have been screaming about this. And I think a lot of us feel like we've been ignored today. And hopefully, this will change the way that we think about our online ecosystem and the fact that these online discussions have real world harm.
Well, and then, I guess thinking about the future of studying disinformation, Trump's kind of the white whale. Like he brings everyone's like, oh, I get it. I understand now. A guy like Donald Trump can become president because of stuff that's on Facebook. But when he's not the president, I mean, what is the hook, I guess, to remind people that the internet is not just not true, it is actually actively sort of harming most internet users? Because I think at this point, it's maybe I'd be wrong, but it feels like most internet users are getting a warped view of reality when they log on.
Yeah, I think you're right. We are primed to expect that the content that's being presented to us by social media is trustworthy, but actually it's the stuff that's going to keep us most engaged. And I think we need a big awareness building campaign about what the platforms are actually doing. They're looking after their bottom line in the end. They're not necessarily looking after the quality of the information that you're consuming or your safety in your offline environment and based on what you're seeing online. And once Donald Trump is out of office, I think he's going to continue to rely on social media to build his brand, to communicate with his base of support. And whatever his future plans are going to be basically hinged on social media. And after he exits the Oval Office, I think the platforms have a big decision to make about not only how they enforce their rules or whether, not only that, but also the fact that they're going to have to make this decision about whether or not this user who has violated those rules so many times should remain on the platform.
All right. Unfortunately, something that is not going away anytime soon. Nina Jankowicz is a senior fellow at the Wilson Center studying dis and misinformation on the internet. Nina, thanks so much for your time this morning. We'll talk soon.
Thanks for having me.